Hey everyone, welcome to episode 21 of the Digital Difference with me, Scott Gulliver, and Oliver Moradi.
Hi, everyone.
And today, Ollie, we're going to be talking about testing, aren't we? Testing in digital products and what that means, what it can bring, and why you should do it, I guess.
And why it's so important, I guess, as well.
To kick things off, then, did you want to start off with hopefully an obvious point, but why should we test? And I guess what even is testing in relation to digital products?
Well, it's a very important part of the design process, I think. And that's why if you think about design thinking in itself, when we go back to design thinking, it's a very valuable part of it. It's the last point within the 5 stages of design thinking. So you have your empathize to your test. And your test is there to ensure that you're actually, let's take it back to its basics. The test is there to ensure that you're delivering a product that's actually going to work when it goes out to market or when you're delivering to an audience. I think anybody within a design background or a build background, especially within the digital sector, needs to test, and there's always that not just that need, but that want to test to ensure that that best product is actually being delivered. And I think that and fundamentally is why it's so important, because you as a designer and developer can get so into the detail that you can miss minor things, and those minor things can be a real problem. Not only is the testing phase good for that, but the testing phase is also good to iron out any bugs or any sort of functions or features that you've put in that may not actually work. So let's not think about it from a product perspective, whether the product's actually working or not. It's whether it's actually good from a user experience perspective as well. So there might be that level of those ideas that you have in the initial ideation phase, for instance, where you think, oh yeah, this will be great. But then actually when it comes to prototyping and then testing that prototype, you realize, well, actually, no, it doesn't work. So, it's not just about whether it actually functions, it's whether it works from a user perspective as well.
Yeah, that's a great introduction. You've covered most of my points, which is awesome. I mean, I guess we can start to dive into detail. I mean, the first point you kind of mentioned was that that it should be involved in the design phase. And I think that's quite often a missed step, isn't it? Because probably when people think of testing, they think of creating a product and then putting it out there, or creating an experience and putting it out there and testing it that way, or maybe just before it goes for release. But like you said, I think there's an important part of testing in the early design phases, aren't there?
Yeah, 100%. And again, I think this is you're not testing from a functionality perspective. You're testing from, does this work? I mean, is this right for my audience? It's more from a user experience perspective. You're testing, I think, from at that point, and making sure that the product is actually being built for the right reasons, and is hitting the audience in the way that's expected. It's covering the brief that you've been given, for instance, if you have been given a brief. Most of the time, that's how I work anyway. So it's whether those objectives and those KPIs are being hit with this product, and that's kind of why you need to have this test phase in the design period. I mean, for me, I've seen it so many times where people haven't tested something because they've been rushed for a deadline, for instance. And they thought, well, we'll skip the testing phase, or we'll do a very bare minimum test, and it's gone out, and not from a functionality perspective. Maybe it's worked from a functionality perspective, but the key points have been missed from a user experience perspective. I think it's really important. I mean, Scott, for you as a developer, I mean, I think the user experience is way more important than me as an instructional designer. I mean, yes, for me as an instructional designer, I have to have a good user experience in terms of like engagement within the actual learning itself. So how that works. But as a developer, I think for you, user experience is probably that key thing that you initially have to test on. Is that what you find?
It is, yeah. And like you said, it's the first thing I think to go out the window when deadlines are tight. And the thinking only goes so far, doesn't it? Because it can be ultimately, if nothing's tested and not thought through or tested at the right stages, that can be pretty damaging to brand and reputation ultimately, or potentially customers as well. But even without going to that extreme, it's potentially a waste of time, and you're probably spending a lot more time on doing things that you haven't tested, or at least fixing them when they're in production, which is difficult. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's an important part of certainly the software world, I think, and almost anything digital really. And the great thing about digital is that we've just got there's so many steps between final product and initial idea and final product, that there's plenty of opportunity to test on the way. I think, like you said, that initial idea and testing that's a really valuable thing to do, because it course corrects immediately, or at least gets some initial feedback of whether it's along the right track or not to begin with. I think you mentioned at the start as well about that kind of internal team. And I think you can get in this kind of echo chamber a lot of the time, can't you? Where ideas are kicked around internally and they sound great until it's released, and then all of a sudden it doesn't quite hit the mark. And at that early stage, I mean, I guess you haven't probably got a built product at that point, have you, necessarily? So what are we testing? I guess prototypes is one thing. Are there other things that we can kind of test in that scope?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the prototype, but even the wireframes at an early stage, I think, can be tested.
Right.
Personally, your initial design, let's go for me for a storyboard, that can even go through testing. And I think that people think of testing and they think of an actual finished digital product, but testing should be a phase that goes through. Not even that. Let's even go back further than that, and let's go. And I know I'm building this really around design thinking right now, but let's go to our define period as well. Like, you've defined your goals, and you take out your goals to different groups, and you kind of ask, is this the right approach? And you're kind of testing those theories and those overall designs. So for me, it's learning objectives. Like, you need to test those at some point as well. I think that every stage should be tested, and I don't think that people should confuse what testing is within a digital world or with anything. Like, testing should be done on everything. It's not just about testing a digital product or testing a final piece. It should be there continuously, as almost like you said, Scott, that feedback and that constructive criticism, to tell you whether your product is hitting the right audience, is actually doing what it's supposed to do. And therefore, by testing at these crucial stages, you're ultimately going to come out with a better product that's going to have less issues on delivery than it is if you don't test during these previous phases. Let's go back and we say, right, okay, well, we're going to skip testing in the empathy stage. We're going to skip testing in the define stage. We're going to skip testing in the ideation phase, and we're just going to test on the prototype, and we're going to test on the test phase. So let's not test on these three. And now I know when we say test in the test phase, that's more getting constructive feedback from a group or a stakeholder. So that's not actually testing in itself. That's not saying testing as a whole. It kind of covers everything. So I'm talking about actual testing. So let's take it back to, we don't do it those first three steps, and we just do it for the prototype and the test phase. So ultimately what we're testing is a product that we've kind of prototyped and we built, and we're testing at a feedback stage. So we have one feedback stage. Now, most of the time what's going to happen is, because you've skipped those first three periods of testing and you haven't used user groups or anything like that within these first three periods, what you're going to find is that people are going to automatically assume, well, this is the product. Well, this is what the product should look like. So immediately what's going to happen is people have this idea in their head that this is how it's going to look. So there's no innovation to change that idea, or there's no thinking behind, thinking outside the box. So yeah, innovation basically to change the idea or make any constructive criticism on the idea itself. It's more about how the prototype works and how it functions. So you're going to go to that final stage. You're going to build out this amazing product that might not actually do what it's supposed to do, might function brilliantly because you've tested at the prototype phase and you're testing at the test phase, and you're also then testing after the build phase, but you haven't ultimately tested the idea. And because you haven't tested the idea, you haven't actually come out with the product that you wanted and what the stakeholder has initially envisioned.
Yeah, absolutely. It's much harder for people to give criticism, as you say, isn't it, when something's there and built? People are much likely at that stage to think about that a certain bit of text doesn't read quite right, or an image isn't quite in the right place, rather than rethinking the entire solution. And the earlier you can course correct, the more chance or likelihood you've got of coming up with something that's a bit more suited for purpose. I think, not from just an outside opinion kind of perspective as well, but for internal teams, it's much harder, isn't it? Because they may get feedback that it's not quite working. And I think because of the whole sunk cost that you've probably spent up to that point, it's much easier to try and rejig what you've currently got rather than starting from scratch again, obviously. So Yeah, hugely important. And this is the problem, I think, with Agile, is that because it's at a later stage, people consider it to be a more important aspect of the later phases of a project. I think what actually happens in the early stages is testing is considered to be making sure it works as we intend it to before we ship out to users. But actually, a lot of the time that should be really poking, especially in the early stages, poking the actual user experience, you say, and really figuring out, is this the right thing? That's awesome. So that's obviously a lot on setting the initial direction and testing the, I guess, the idea and the initial concept. Let's say we've got all that right. What comes next? What's the next phase?
I think the next phase is then, I mean, initially what you want to do is, you, like I said, you want to get that ideation, that idea right. I think the next phase is then prototyping. So we go into the build phase. I mean, we've already prototyped generally okay, so if we're taking a design thinking approach, we've already prototyped during that phase, but then you're going to have stage 2 of a prototype. So you're going to have an alpha build at least. And I think that then during that period, consistent testing throughout needs to be done, not just on how again, I'm going back to this, but not just on how it functions, but whether it's actually doing what it's supposed to do, whether it's performing in the way it's supposed to perform, and whether it's actually delivering what it's supposed to deliver. So I think that, this is a phase where in the early stages of the build, although you do have that stage initially in the prototyping, this is where you need to test to amend. And I think that a lot of the time you will find that you will be doing a lot of amends on this alpha build. You'll realize there's a lot of ideas that just can't work. So that this is a time also for innovation to come into play as well, and to think outside the box and think about different ways of doing something. And this is where testing is vital. And this is where having a good tester on board is also vital as well. If you don't have a good tester and you don't have someone who's completely thorough and knows what they're looking for, again, key things can be missed. And testers often, I think testers are often the unsung heroes, really, because they spend hours and hours and hours going over the same thing, going through different paths on a site, for instance, or different paths on an app, testing every single thing, trying to break a product or trying to break an alpha build, or even finding out different ways of whether something works or whether it's actually delivering the way it should be delivering. But this is where it's vital to have key testers, and this is where that actual digital product needs to be tested thoroughly, continuously. So each version you do needs to be tested thoroughly. And I think you see that a lot with gaming now, actually. And I kind of think that Rockstar do it on purpose. When they create their games, I remember seeing it on Red Dead Redemption 2. They put the version number in the bottom. I think it was version 1127. So you know that someone has gone through that game. If you know how big that game is as well, let's just say as a build, from a digital perspective, someone has gone through and tested that game 1,127 times. That is mental. And found out that I mean, they must have been the person who absolutely hated that game at the end of it.
It's only fun for so long, isn't it?
Exactly. But think about how many bugs they found, and that end user experience was incredible. And it was a great game, and it got so many awards and etc. and so forth. And you just apply that thinking to any digital product that you create. So you need to test. So yes, I think that's with any digital product. I think that you find with most digital products that have gone to release, they've gone through many, many, many different times of testing, and they've gone through many different rounds of amending. I'm not going to say names of companies. I think there's a lot of companies, big companies and corporations who create software, don't bother testing, and just push it out and cause a lot of people a lot of problems. They rhyme with Microsoft, who seem to do it quite a lot. But I think that there are also some companies that do test thoroughly, and I think that there's a certain level of expectation with testing now that it just needs to be right. Otherwise, people are more. There's more of this feedback, isn't there, that we're getting from society at the moment from people, and I think that it's more important for people to actually test software, because it's all about user feedback, and in the end of the day, if the end user experience isn't good, people are going to hate it.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, testers, or I guess quality assurance people, it's a difficult role, isn't it? Because you've got to balance being able to go through at such a fine detail level, really close, making sure that every path works, as you say, every little detail is right. But then also, it's not just about the functionality and whether it's up to spec, but it's also is it right, and does it make sense in the wider context? And then being able to take that step back as well, and actually look at the whole holistic thing and think, is this still hitting the right approach across the board? To be able to take both those roles is really difficult. And I think this points again to why it's so important to get that early stage direction right, because once you've nailed that, you can actually go back to starting focusing on the details and the colors of things and the labels of things, and all of that starts to make a lot more sense at that point.
Absolutely. And do you think at this phase as well, Scott, that user groups are almost just as important as testers?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think they're underused, to be honest, and I think there are a lot of services trying to make that easier now. There's a lot of online tools you can use where you can book people anonymously to give feedback. I think even that level is way above more than most people do. But you're right. I mean, I think the problem with user groups is they're used at early stages, which is fantastic. And that's probably, if you're going to use them anywhere, that's probably the time to use them. But yeah, throughout is key. And especially if you're going for a truly waterfall approach where you slowly add in features, I think keeping a close eye on those features and making sure that you're not detracting from the overall experience is really key to making sure that you're not watering down the overall experience or whatever it is you're building.
Well, one thing that we see quite a lot of nowadays, I think, is companies doing an early launch of a product, and then because network is so good nowadays, and everyone's internet, especially in England, is super fast. So like everyone almost has super fast broadband. I mean, I think probably people average probably about 50 meg in their households. Mm-hmm. It's become the norm that they release an early stage, like almost an MVP of a product test, and then decide to release updates continuously to build that product. Do you think that this is a viable way of getting around testing, because it allows, it's almost sort of supply and demand? There's a high demand for a product, but no one wants to go through the testing phase of building this huge product. So they want it out quickly, so they can do minimal testing on these products, get it out, let the users test, which is what they seem to do, and base it on feedback from what user testing, like from actual user testing, and then make the updates from there. So do you feel that this is how kind of people are approaching testing nowadays? It's more just, let's let the public test, and we'll just update and not bother testing ourselves?
I think there's a lot more of that out there these days, and I think for good reason, because I actually think there's a huge demand for that approach generally. Certainly, I think people are used to having things that update regularly. They want things that keep moving forward. Depends what industry you're in and what product you're developing, but generally, for example, taking kind of IT people, they love getting the latest thing and actually having something that's on the bleeding edge, even if it comes with bugs. So whether they're signing into some sort of beta group, for example, that they're quite aware they're probably going to get a buggy experience, but they'll happily trade that because they're getting some of the greatest features out there. I think the problem with it is that it depends the level of testing you're really after, and I think there certainly needs to be a level of functional testing done before it goes out. I mean, there's just so much that you can risk, and I know there's a lot of warnings that come with those kind of groups, but potentially losing all of your data, for example, is a huge risk with a lot of apps and operating systems and everything else where you're on the bleeding edge. And I think that there does need to be rigorous testing around that to make sure that it's not going to be a terrible experience. But I think getting the user experience back that way and getting some indication as to whether features are being used, getting real world stats, not just user groups, but actually real world stats as to what's being used, where it's being used, and everything else is incredibly invaluable. But it also takes a lot of time to do that. That needs a properly big company to be able to support that level of feedback. And I think it's a tempting thing to do for companies, but they probably don't understand the level of infrastructure it needs to really go out there. I think user groups and small test groups initially are probably a much safer idea.
I understand why people use it, and I think that obviously with having the general public test something, you're going to get absolutely every bug there is possible reported. Not only that, you're also probably going to have a massive, invaluable amount of data returned to you from general feedback as well, which I get, amazing. But equally, I think you're tarnishing the product by sending it out not fully fixed. So for me, I think it's finding that happy medium and sending it out to a pre-audience. And I think Google do it very well they make it known it's a beta version that they're sending out. So let's talk about Google Chrome, like Chrome beta, for instance. With every single Android release, they always do a beta version as well. So they make it known that you're going to get this beta version. A lot of techie people will be like, yeah, definitely, I want this new version, even if it doesn't work. And I was exactly one of these people when I had the Google Pixel, who really wanted to get that new version. And to be honest with you, it annoyed me every single day because it didn't work well and didn't function well, but I'd wanted the new features. And to be quite honest, or to be quite frank, I actually went back to then going back to the old version of Android because it just annoyed me so much about how buggy it was.
Great.
So I think that, but equally, I think that, if you're a developer or a techie guy who actually knows what they're talking about and wants the new features, but also knows what could be going wrong, that feedback can be valuable. And I think that there's so many people that are probably out there being like, okay, well, this app doesn't work. I actually build loads of apps and this is why, or I can tell that this is why. And you're getting free testing, basically. I think it just tarnishes the end product, personally. I think that when the end product does release, you're kind of like, this is how it should have worked. But it's just a bit like, well, yeah, I've seen it now, but I've also seen it with all its flaws. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a whole level of trust as well that gets a little bit impacted. Even if you're signing up to it and, opting into that process, it still eats away at that overall kind of stability and trust that you hold for something, doesn't it?
Exactly. And you buy a product because you want it to work properly. And you buy a product to offer a certain level of service, essentially. And, with all of these beta products, they don't offer that full service. They say they do, obviously, and they also say there's probably not going to be working or functioning properly. But equally, and even if you do sign up for that, you still know that you're not going to get that product that you want, and it's always going to be that problem. So personally, for me, the approach that I would take is user groups. Beta, I get it, I think is a great approach, but personally, if it's a smaller release, I'd use user groups.
Yeah, I totally agree. And thinking about, obviously testing, as we know, is becoming a huge focus. And I think projects are generally becoming more complex. The tools are becoming a little easier, but certainly the solutions I think we're creating day to day are now getting more complex, bigger, interwoven with everything else. Automation has always been, for the past kind of 5-10 years, quite a big trend that we're seeing, and certainly a big focus of where time is being spent. Do you see much automation testing in your world, Ollie?
Not really in my world.
No,
I mean, it's not really a big thing in my world. I think it's more, I think because we test more from a perspective of, is the product engaging? So it's more from a user experience, I guess. I kind of, it's almost like, it's almost from a KPI perspective, I guess. So no, I don't think automation is a big factor in my world. I mean, it must be in your world though, right?
Yeah, it is. And actually on the KPI aspect, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think one thing that probably isn't obvious as an automation of testing, although it is kind of a distant cousin, is stats and kind of dashboards and seeing trends of that over time potentially. But yeah, you're right. In software, it's a huge thing. And again, this is, if anything's thrown out that window first, this gets thrown out the window first. In fact, from my experience, it's thrown out more often than not. But it's a hugely important thing because, as with all of these things, it's an investment in saving time down the road. And as systems get more and more complex, you're going to be taking on more and more risk because obviously, as you build your features out, and hopefully your users as well, you're suddenly going to be releasing things that probably aren't fully tested in a testing cycle. Even with a team of testers, there could well be cuts made to certain areas of the application just when there isn't time to fully test everything. They've probably got some must-haves that they must test through the path. But having that level of automation across the board really does give you kind of a push-button scenario to be able to release features and have good confidence that what was there already is at least working to the level it should be. It's a good kind of last line of defense as well. And ultimately, in software teams specifically, if you're really good at getting this right, what you can start to enable is that someone commits a new feature into the code base, and that gets kind of built into the app itself or the website itself. And then as long as all the automated tests pass, that can kind of go out without any testers having looked at it. Ultimately, you want testers involved nice and early as well in that stage, and they can really start to focus their attention on kind of shaping requirements around what they've learned and testing the really important stuff. It's just about refocusing their time. But yeah, and certainly the tools are getting better in the software world for that, which is good. And there's just a lot more focus on it as well, which is good. It's coming out of the 10% of companies do it and the rest pay lip service to it. It's actually being a real focus, especially for new projects. I think it's kind of seen as one of the more important things to get right from the start.
Yeah. I mean, what's your opinion on sandbox environments? And do you think they play a major role in testing, on all aspects of testing, even with automation? Do you think that they play a massive part in it, or do you think that it may as well just test on the live version and see what happens?
Yeah, I mean, again, certainly coming from a software world, we've kind of had these things figured out for a while. I think in other aspects, it's not as well done. But having what we would call kind of environments is very, very useful. So being able to kind of start from a clean slate and test everything up towards a working state. And then ultimately being able to tear that down and start again is really useful, especially in the automation world, but equally important in manual testing. And there can be edge cases. I mean, certainly when you release to users, there's always going to be a few edge cases based on their existing setup. So I think a lot of apps can have this problem occasionally where the data isn't in quite a good state and it's perhaps a little bit of an older version and doesn't quite line up with a new version. And you'll always get a few edge cases in production. That's just the way of the world. But yeah, sandboxes play a great part in being able to quickly fire up scenarios, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
So before we kind of wrap up, Ollie, I mean, one last thing I wanted to talk about was the role of stakeholders in kind of more traditional teams and where they fit in the overall testing cycle. And I think in waterfall projects, it was a bit more obvious where they sat because ultimately it would be kind of functionally tested and then almost handed over for kind of sign off. And that would in itself be what we might have called user acceptance testing or something similar. Where do you think that sits these days in modern approaches?
Good question. Let's say that everybody takes the agile approach because it's the trendy thing to do. I think that now people try and get the stakeholder and the SMEs as close to the day-to-day as possible. So within every Scrum meeting, you're going to have. So if anybody doesn't know what a Scrum meeting is, it's where a group or a project will meet up weekly to discuss what their tasks are for the week and what they're going to complete within a sprint. And a sprint is a period between the Scrum meetings, basically, to say it in basic terms. And it's just it's there just to kind of break down the project into manageable tasks and just to complete tasks at a time. And I think that this is kind of the approach that most digital projects and most digital most digital products and most digital projects are taking now when they're going through the build phase, all the way from the initiation to the build phase, and then to the delivery. I think that they're taking this sort of agile approach, and I think that because of this agile approach, because of these Scrum meetings and these weekly calls, I think that the SMEs are kept on board throughout more. So I think that, in my opinion, it's much better because the SMEs and the stakeholders are obviously usually the ones who sign off. So from experience, from a general waterfall approach, you would have the stakeholder tell you what they want. You'd go off, you'd ideate, you'd go build, and then you'd come to maybe an alpha build where you're pretty much there. And the stakeholder will turn around and go, actually, no, I didn't want this functionality. This isn't right. This isn't right. This isn't right. And then you've got 2 weeks before delivery to push it out. And then you've got to also go through testing. Now, this is where most people go, do you know what? We've only got 2 weeks to make all these changes. How the hell are we going to do that? Okay, well, we're going to have to eat into testing time. Testing can go on the back, can take a back seat, or we'll eat into testing time as much as possible so we can actually make sure that we deliver this product on time. And I think that's the problem with waterfall. Whereas I think where agile works really well with this is it keeps the SME on board. So when these initial issues pop up, they know about it and they can say, actually, I don't like that. Actually, this feature shouldn't really be coming in. Actually, this functionality, this part of the app or this part of the website or learning, whatever it is, this should function like this. So immediately you're quashing any issues there and then. And I think that's where agile works really well compared to where waterfall the stakeholder comes on right at the end, and you get all these problems, and testing gets the brunt of it, basically. I mean, is that sort of same experience you have?
Yeah, it sounds like you've had some pretty sore experiences of that. Yeah, that is certainly what I see quite a lot. I think ultimately, in an ideal world, the stakeholders aren't just the ones with the budgets and the sign off. They should really be the ones that are like you say, the SMEs, the subject matter experts, but also hopefully someone who's really close to the users. And if that's not the stakeholder, and that ultimately do still need to hold the strings to sign off, then maybe that needs to be pushed to some sort of UX team or UX person or someone who's a bit closer to the users. And I think, as you say, that the more they're involved throughout, the better, just to course correct early and give their input. And it's interesting what you said as well about how testing tends to get bumped, because a lot of what I've seen actually is that often there's such a reluctance to hand something over to a stakeholder because it's not been properly tested first, that there's so little time to really for them to sign off. And then if they don't sign off, then that's a huge problem to deadlines. Whereas actually, I think that's probably a healthier thing for me, is if the stakeholders are much more in touch with how agile projects work and just how the cycle works within their company, and if they're quite comfortable working around a few little bugs and issues and actually looking at the wider picture, I think that's a much better place to be. If they can operate comfortably in that space, then testing can always happen alongside their sign off and at least get rolling at the same time.
Yep, absolutely.
Cool. Thanks everyone for joining us as always today. We'll have the next episode out as always in 2 weeks' time. If you liked the episode today, we would love it if you could tell a friend about us, recommend the podcast, and leaving a review on iTunes. It takes a few minutes, but it gives us a massive boost. So we really would appreciate that. And yeah, thanks as always. We'll see you in the next one.
Cool. Thanks, guys.